My name is Bassam Haddad. I am the director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program and a teacher here at this fantastic university. And I have been here for about 13 years. And since the very beginning, we have struggled with various issues of discrimination, racism, and various forms of exclusion, from the small to the large. And this is not a particular case here in George Mason. It's actually much worse elsewhere. So we actually are, in many ways, luckier than many other campuses where you hear literally horror stories. Nonetheless, what we aim for is to weed out as much as possible, by working together, any sort of discrimination that undermines the environment here at George Mason in any way, shape, or form. We don't have to all agree on everything, but we do have to agree on the rejection of discrimination of all sorts. This particular event or this particular initiative focuses on anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and discrimination in the name of religion. Of course, the latter or the former two are evident, unfortunately, from the horror stories that have been taking place all over the world and in the United States, from the shootings in synagogues or mosques, and very recently, the dramatic, horrific shooting in Sri Lanka in the church around Easter. We also added discrimination in the name of religion because, as we all know, sometimes religion is abused by groups, individuals, to discriminate against others. So we are not unaware of the fact that discrimination happens in all these cases and many more. We just really have not been able to fight everything at the same time in one or two events. So we're focusing on these instances. We have gathered last December to do the first iteration of this event, which was extremely successful, a great crowd like we have here. We met at Hub, I think, and we had a really good and productive discussion. We actually agreed to do this again, which we are doing right now, and we also agreed to reserve some time for students to actually run events of the sort. We have with us a number of fantastic and capable professors. I'll just read their names, and I will not be able to read your bios. I apologize. Randy Rashkover from Judaic Studies, Char Miller from Shar School, Sumaya Hamdani from History and Art History, Patricia Maulden from Dialogue and Difference Project, Mark Gopin from School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, Maria Dekek from Religious Studies, Hossein Yilmaz from History and Art History, Lisa Breglia from Global Affairs, Noura Arakat from School of Integrative Studies, Hatem Al-Hibri from Film and Media Studies. Patricia and myself will be moderating, generally speaking. Patricia will moderate primarily the breakout session because she is extremely knowledgeable and capable and experienced in those matters. This is how I met her 12 years ago or something like that when she invited me to one of these events. And I'm happy that they have joined to co-sponsor. The co-sponsors are many, including the Middle East and Islamic Studies program, Dialogue and Difference Project, Cultural Studies, History and Art History, Center for Global Islamic Studies, Shar School of Policy and Government, Sociology and Anthropology, Film and Media Studies, Center for World Religions, Diplomacy and Conflict Resolution. We also, before we get going, we have a special guest who was, in my view, aware enough about the importance of this topic, the importance of people in this community feeling comfortable, feeling empowered, and decided to make time to join us. So please allow me to introduce our first speaker who will herald the event, Dr. Angel Cabrera, President of GMU.
Thank you. Well, I'm here just to say thank you. A huge thank you, Patricia. Thank you so much for agreeing to moderate this. Thank you, Bassam, for calling us together. I believe that a big role that universities like ours can have, should have, as an example for everybody else in our society is this ability to have difficult conversations about difficult, important, consequential issues that affect our society, and to show that this is the way to get through these issues, is just by having this conversation. So I want to thank every single one of my colleagues on this panel for doing this and for showing what dialogue in practice is, and how there's a better way to what we see constantly in the media. So I want to thank them. I want to thank all of you for being interested in this topic. Some of you because you may have been on the receiving end from what shows on the title of this, and others who may not have been, and yet you want to learn more about what it is like to live being a person of a certain religious belief, which may not be always accepted and understood. So I thank all of you. Obviously, we're reading, as Bassam said, from some tragic events, and unfortunately, they're not exceptional, and unfortunately, they're not just far away. And clearly, we're just went through the trauma of what happened in Colombo in Sri Lanka, but before that, it was Christchurch in New Zealand. And lest we not think that all this is stuff that happens far away, we've had attacks to Jewish temples right here in Fairfax not too long ago. Hatred, discrimination, this whole sense of excluding the other. This is a dangerous and a painful human dynamic that is not just happens in faraway places. It happens here. I love when people ask me, people who don't know much about George Mason, and they ask me what Mason is like. One of the things I really love and I always highlight is how incredibly diverse our university is. And I do. I mean, I think for many of us, this probably is the most diverse environment that we've ever been part of. But what's amazing about this is that we get to learn from people who are different from us. We get to strike friendships that we never expected, to learn, to hear opinions, and to keep our minds open. And as a consequence, it makes us better. I just want us not to take this for granted. Some of you are about to graduate in just a few weeks, and this is special. And it's special because we make it and keep it special. And it takes work. Work, even when things happen or things are said or done that you disagree with, that's when you show what it means to be part of an inclusive community. In a way, I feel like the work that we do together is one of ever expanding the definition of the we, and who belongs to that we. And this is just a beautiful, wonderful demonstration of how that works. So thank you, Bassam. Thank you to all my colleagues. Can't wait to let the dialogue begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The people standing in the back, we do have 6 open seats, so please feel free to make your way. Don't worry about interrupting. You're not interrupting. We want you to be comfortable. Just walk up, unless you're planning to leave any minute and you don't want to interrupt twice. That's fine. That's reasonable. Okay, I would like to start by asking Patricia to say a few words, and then we're actually going down the list as it appears on the flyer. I will just introduce the people because I've read so many names and you might not know who's who. So I will start with asking Patricia to take the floor.
I can sit down.
You can do whatever you like.
I'm going to take the floor from my seat. What I'm going to talk about is a concept called radical listening. I like the word radical, so I try to link it to anything I can. But the idea of radical listening is intentionally quieting what the internal monologue is that we often have when somebody's talking, or planning our next move rhetorically in response. It is being present with the person who is speaking, consciously, intently, and person to person, human to human. And spending judgments, which is hard to do if you have a discussion going for where you don't agree. But I think it's I've seen this fundamentally important. Easy, it seems easy, but it's really hard. It's really hard to be there. I mean, if you're talking for 2 minutes and truly be there for 2 minutes, it's tiring. But you're putting that much energy. If I'm doing that, I'm putting that much energy into and sharing that person's story and that person's 2 minutes of that person's life. And they're honoring me with that. And so I need to reciprocate by honoring what they're saying in trying to understand. One of the things that often happens in discrimination and hierarchy in any sense is the evaluation of one group above another. And those determinations can be made in any number of ways. They're made every single day. We make them ourselves. And to really break down discrimination, I'm not saying we have to agree. I'm just saying to really see a human being as a human being, the same as myself, with the same value on the planet, that can take some work. And it takes consciousness at least. Do I recognize the inherent human dignity of everybody I'm working with? If I don't, I have a problem. Do I think or do I ponder dehumanizing language around anyone? Maybe somebody, they did something. So it's so simple then to say, oh, they are X. And that's the beginning of negative thoughts about that person, maybe their family, who knows. But if we want to walk the talk, it's going to be painful and hard in some cases. And it's going to require conscious thought. I worked with this I spent 3 days in maximum security prison a couple weeks ago, and I got to come out at the end of the day. But they didn't. And so we had a lesson about radical listening, and they just thought, yeah. And who listens to a person, a lifer? Who listens to, they have no value in the system. And that is an extreme case, of course. But the idea of, do we value humans that have harmed us? At least valuing them as humans. I'm not saying we want to hang around with them. But how do we do that? And I don't have answers for it. I'm raising the question, and I'm raising the idea that maybe if we want to overcome some of these things, that might be one way to think about it. And so radical listening, human to human, no dehumanizing thoughts or language. Repent if you do that. And I do it, so I'm speaking to myself also. And how do we see the innate human dignity in every single person that we meet? And that can change the way we see ourselves, and that can actually change the way we see the world and how we deal with it. So that's my thought.
Thank you.
Bassam.
Thank you, Patricia. Right now we have to move to our panelists. I have a bit of a strict rule in order for us to all be able to speak and then have these breakout sessions, and that is each person will speak for 2 minutes, and then the alarm will sound at 2 minutes. And you'll have 30 seconds to complete your thoughts. That's 10 people, that's a lot of minutes. I know it's not a lot of minutes for each person, as we discussed, but we also would like to have these discussions afterwards. The song is set to Down Under by Men at Work. I don't know why.
That's a great song.
But I'm not going to change it.
That's a great
so that
song.
it's disruptive. I'm sorry for doing that. We'll start with Professor Randy Ashkover, who will actually herald the panelist discussions. And since you have not been with us last time, I actually will sound the alarm because I did it last time. So please don't be offended.
Okay, there's no time for any joke. I just used up 50 seconds. Okay, I was going to give you, I'm the Judaic Studies professor, so I thought I would give you a very, very quick history of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, really, really quickly, so we understand the difference. So anti-Judaism, which is arguably in Western culture, arguably the source, or at least the underpinning of modern anti-Semitism, is a product of a polemic between early Christianity and Judaism. First Christians were Jews, and so they were sort of in a family kind of set of altercations with other Jews. Unfortunately, ultimately, because Jews didn't fundamentally recognize the central claim of Christianity, namely that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, that polemic began to develop and increased and became even more damaging between the two traditions, particularly as Christianity became its own separate religious tradition. As time goes on, Christianity is still struggling with that theological polemic, and what develops is what's called supersessionism, which is the notion that the covenant that God makes with people through Christ supersedes or replaces the covenant that God made with the Jewish people. That tradition becomes crystallized in a whole number of major church father writings called the Adversus Judaeus tradition, where you see anti-Jewish points of view crystallized side by side with Christian theological claims. Obviously, all of this reaches a height in the Middle Ages, where you see rampant anti-Judaism within Christian society. It appeared, of course, that a lot of the pressure of anti-Judaism was going to be lifted once we had the move out of Christendom and into Western modernity. Unfortunately, however, what happens is that with the transformation from ecclesiastical power into modern secularism, we have a parallel transformation from anti-Judaism into anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism runs parallel to both the increasing opportunity for Jews to become citizens in Western Europe, guaranteeing that they are pressured to perform and behave like non-Jewish people. Ultimately, after Napoleon emancipates the Jews in the 19th century, we have really the rise of anti-Semitism in Western Europe. You have things like the Dreyfus Affair. In Eastern Europe, in Russia, ultimately this culminates in Tsarist Russia and the expulsion of the Jews at the end of at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century. So ultimately, the story in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, which is a story of anti-Semitism, ultimately culminates into the Zionist movement. And the fundamental point that I want you to appreciate is that Zionism, as it develops in the end of the 19th century, is a response to anti-Semitism. The tragedy is that Zionism, as an effort by Jews to respond to rising tides of anti-Semitism, becomes mired in the political turmoil of participating in a world of Arab attempts to overcome colonialism and the Palestinian problem. But Zionism was never meant to be itself a motivator of additional anti-Semitism. It was itself a response to the problem of anti-Semitism that Jews had been experiencing for 2,000 years.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to introduce people. Thank you, Randy, from Judaic Studies. I would appreciate it to cut on time. I will shut up for the rest of the panelist discussions, and you can just move the microphone over and introduce yourself. That would be awesome.
Okay. Wow, that was amazing. I'm Char Miller, and I teach political theory and government here at George Mason. And I often, actually recently, sort of have voiced with friends complaints about living in a democracy in which most of the people voted for different candidates, but you get the candidate that they didn't vote for in a kind of low-key sort of manner. And I'm told by most of my friends and acquaintances that this is just a way democratic republics work, and I should sort of pipe down about that. But I'm increasingly sort of aware, and because in these conversations, there's sort of it will go to, well, what would you call this country, right? Like it's a democracy, it's a republic, what would you call it? And in sort of trying to articulate the way power works here, it's become really difficult for me to think about thinking about power in the United States without thinking about race, right? And I want to set that up to say, like, I think this goes into perhaps the category of a nation state, that nation states come out of are born in relationship to racial categories. So again, if you think about the United States, you want to think about the way power works here. I mean, you have to think about prisons, like who's in prisons. The U.S. is 5% of the world's population, but 20% of the prison population. How is this place being governed? I mean, that's a component, I think, an answer to what kind of country you have would have to require attention to. The same with the Electoral College, right? I mean, and I think this is something that I feel more aware of now than before in ways like articulating the way basic Republican, democratic institutions of self-government are in fact deeply enmeshed with racial categories. That the Electoral College is sort of created to protect to sort of protect the invention of whiteness in a way, right? Like who's going to count as a citizen? And this question of like who counts as a citizen but who doesn't count, I mean, kind of keeps cropping up in a bunch of ways here. I mean, you can see like the vote in Israel on Gaza. You can see the vote, or when you're talking to your uncle, or my uncle, about sort of the American, about, in my case, how much I disdain Thomas Jefferson. Don't tell anybody outside this room. But the sense that you often get from my uncle is like, well, yeah, but at the time it was fine. Like it wasn't, everybody didn't realize slavery was wrong at the time. And you're like, yeah, but all the slaves did, right? Like, and it's like this moment where that category of like, who doesn't count as a participant in the population, right, is figured out already. And again, I think that you can see not only that at the level of like who counts as the population or the people and the relationship between those institutions. So if I was going to try to give an account of like what kind of government we have, again, all I'm sort of saying, I guess I would sort of solicit that from you. Like how would you begin to name an institution that works this way? And I would briefly add, as a coda, a sense that I think these racial categories, because I've been gesturing towards race, and I think the kind of race is a category deeply political, theological in a way, connected to notions of purity that are, as you suggested, towards kind of things you could talk about in a slightly different vein. It might help unpack some of that. But again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Samaya Hamdani. I teach in the history department, and I teach Islamic and Middle East history. And I would try to do what Professor Rashkover did, but I don't think I'm going to be as successful. Perhaps my colleague, Professor Dekek, will do that, explaining Islam on various issues. I wanted to bring my comments down to the personal and the historical. As for the personal, I am sorry to say that I have experienced Islamophobia as a faculty member on this campus, for example. I've experienced Islamophobia outside of this campus, of course. I've been here a while. I'm old. I've lived through things like the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and being in America at the time was not comfortable for people who were Muslim. And then again, of course, after 2011. But the experience that I had on campus really kind of reveals the extent to which Islamophobia, for me at any rate, reveals the extent to which Islamophobia is something that masquerades as racism or racism masquerading as Islamophobia. I teach Middle East history, and in the course of my discussions about the Middle East, I, of course, describe the Zionist colonization of Palestine. And apparently, one of my students remembered that. Subsequently, the synagogue bombing occurred in Pittsburgh. The tragic synagogue bombing occurred in Pittsburgh. And as a Jewish student on campus, one of my students was asked by the Mason paper about how he or she felt about being on this campus. And that student recalled to the reporter of the Fourth Estate that I had sort of articulated anti-Semitic comments in my class. And as a result, the newspaper was asking me for my response to this. And I was extremely taken aback, one, because I do not consider myself anti-Semitic, but even in my Ilhan Omar moment, which is what it was appearing to be, I had just signed a letter. I had just signed a letter with colleagues of mine that were outraged that Mason University hired a faculty member who attributed certain politics in this country to a Jewish-funded campaign, a George Soros-funded campaign. So I, in solidarity with other colleagues, had signed this petition asking for the department in question to revisit the hiring of this particular faculty member as, as an expression of my and my colleagues, outrage over these anti-Semitic remarks that this other faculty member had made. So you can imagine the sort of paradoxical situation I found myself in. I asked the newspaper to ask the student again if the student recalled anything anti-Semitic, explicitly anti-Semitic that I might have said, and the student said no, they didn't recall exactly, and so the matter was dropped. But it was an experience like that on this campus as a faculty member that made me wonder the degree to which it was something I said, or it was the fact that as a self-identifying Muslim, and my students know this, right? Whether it was the fact that I was Muslim, and in the context of discussing the Middle East and the state of Israel, I might have said something that the student automatically assumed was anti-Semitic. So I just wanted to raise that as a personal experience that I've had on this campus, and as an example of how the line between Islamophobia and racism is something that is very tricky often. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mark Gopin. I've been here for a long time in conflict analysis and resolution, and I work around the world with. I have multiple identities because I work as a peacemaker, but I work mostly with Muslim women in Syria and other places. But I myself am a rabbi and a Sabbath-observing Jew, which is an unusual combination. So in many ways, I take it personally when people offend Muslims, and I take it personally when people offend Jews or hurt them or try to injure them. So it's one of the things that I've been trying to figure out lately in this whole process is where does this come in terms of our identities, and where does it fit? And one of the keys is that we all have multiple identities. And at any given time, some of them may be going through an injury because other people just don't understand who you are. And that's the place that I think we need to explore. We don't have a clue about all the different identities are of the person that you're talking to. And that's when people offend, sometimes without even intending to offend, or they offend a sacred object that's important to them, or even, and Facebook's a great place, and to just be offended. And I do a lot of my interesting experiments in social psychology on Facebook because it's such a place of raw libidinal anger. And there were people exploring. Somebody was exploring Easter, who happens to be married to a rabbi and is a believing Christian. And interesting combination. And so they had a very interesting theological discussion of the part of Easter that involved the book of John and the demonization of the Jew as the Christ killer, which is more prominent in that gospel than in other gospels. And it's been a big discussion in Christianity for a long time about how to manage the question of the Jew, considering that centrality of Christ killing. And I'm listening to the conversation, I'm finding it fascinating, but at the same time, there's these things running through my head. There's my mother, my grandmother pulling her brother out of the way of somebody on Easter trying to kill them in a small village in Latvia. There's my brother-in-law who remembers his rabbi being crucified and burned to death in another East European place. There's my own memory of almost being drowned by kids in liberal Brookline, Massachusetts, who were told that I was killing Christ. And so they kept my head underwater in the gym, when I was 8 years old, and threw pennies at me because apparently Jews like to pick up pennies. So, these things, here I am, a professor, doing all this work in the world, and yet I'm also a little wounded child. And we all are that. And I think we need to keep that in mind when we have vigorous debates about politics, about rights and wrongs, that we have an intellectual self in the prefrontal cortex, and then we have a wounded self in the lower brainstem. And that we need to have great compassion for that dance that we're all going through, because it's a very imperfect dance. Okay.
Thank you very much. I will speak.
Actually, yes, it's very annoying for me to come up. All you have to do, I know it's a little complex, just move it from here to the next person.
Thank you. Let's see whether I'm able to. So I'll speak as a historian, and
Introduce yourself.
when I look at those good old times, we have forms of discrimination, very simple and very few. As we get more complicated and grow as humanity, looks like instead of those forms of discrimination receding, they are becoming multiplied and also more complicated. Just as an example, if we take Islamophobia, we often think it's Western or Christian attitudes or views of Muslims, but most people in Afghanistan today or Syria and Iraq have nothing to do with Islamophobia. Most people suffering mostly are suffering from other Muslims. So Islamophobia within the broader Muslim community is a lot more important problem to tackle with. So just an example, but my broader comment will be about how can we tackle? Why do we have these forms of discriminations are becoming more and more diverse? And every time we resolve or tend to resolve one, other forms of it popping up. And the reason is, despite the fantastic literature and programs we treat forms of discrimination, we often tend to consider others from a higher moral ground and do a fantastic job actually pinpointing what is discriminatory on others' offensive behavior, decisions, or acts, but do very little to actually mine what may cause our own biases, misperceptions, and culturally ingrained imageries, ideas that may lead us to discriminate with or without being conscious. So that's the basic problem I tend to think that we should confront first. To admit that we are inherently vulnerable to discriminate against the others, because whether we know it or not, in our cultures, in our faiths, in our class consciousness, in our upbringing, even in our language, we have a treasure trove of offensive imageries, concepts, events about the others. So we may do a better job to actually dig that out, because that's what we know best, and offer that as a first line of item to confront our own possible stand on discrimination. Thank you.
Hussein, do you want to introduce yourself? Because you
Just say your name.
Hussein, you didn't
Hussein Yilmaz from History Department.
Good afternoon. I'm Maria Dake from Religious Studies. And one of the nice things about coming toward the end is some people have already said what I've said, so hopefully I won't have to listen to the men down under. But in any case, we meet, of course, sadly, today in the shadow of these two new tragedies. When we met last time, Pittsburgh had just happened, and now we have Christchurch and Colombo. But our panel today is not so much about those larger things, but about discrimination on the basis of religion, which happens sometimes at a much lower, much less dramatic level, but also more pervasive. And so, not that those two things are related always, but certainly a recent polls show that 47% of Americans have a negative view of Islam. And so that kind of creates an environment in which some of these more extreme or radical actions can breed or find sadly, validation. But I wanted to raise a question that's similar to what I raised actually last time, which is the extent to which religion as such plays into religious discrimination. And my colleagues, especially Sumaya, have touched on this as well. How is religious discrimination different from other forms of discrimination, racial discrimination or ethnic discrimination? And I think that these forms of discrimination overlap. I mean, certainly in the Muslim community, many Muslims in the United States are African American or Asian, and so they might experience discrimination in overlapping ways, right? They're marked racially or marked ethnically, as well as being marked religiously. So in some ways, you can say that discrimination on the basis of religion is largely about power, right? About power relations, about people belonging to a particular group, feeling that either their group is losing power or their power is somehow being challenged, or feeling that they don't have enough power and they need to assert or project that power in some way, which makes it not different from any other type of group identity and discrimination. But I think for what makes religious discrimination different, at least for some people, is that, I'll be very quick, is that religion is for many people about absolutes. And so if people think that you are Muslim, that your religion is absolute for you, they think everything you do is motivated by your religion. And they can then easily move from that to saying anyone who holds that religion might be motivated in the same way. So you can see how there's certain ways in which religion can be seen as part of one's identity that isn't assimilatable, right? Or that doesn't melt with the other things in the melting pot. In the minds of some people, I don't think people always know exactly on what basis they're discriminating at any one time.
Thank you.
Thank you to all my colleagues. And again, like you said as well, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to touch on has already been raised, so that's really helpful. So I'm Lisa Bralia from Global Affairs, and the stuff that I think about, write about, and teach about, things like inequality, exploitation, discrimination. Obviously, every once in a while, one of my students, some of you whom are here, will come up to me and say, well, doesn't all of this make you a little bit depressed? And usually, I'll say, well, no, because as long as I can go into classrooms with all of you every day and share together in building skills for critical analysis of whether it's going to be economy, society, cross-cultural difference, even if we're talking about the most depressing things in the world, which would otherwise kind of threaten paralysis, our work of learning together is active analysis. It's critical engagement. It's focused on things that are transformative and even emancipatory. But I feel like this is getting tougher and tougher to do. The mere fact of what's going on in the world is pressing harder and harder on these spaces that we need to figure out how to confront this very same increasingly messed up world. But I would argue the fact that we're facing this contradiction is a good thing, not a bad thing. And if you've ever taken a class with me, you know I love a contradiction, and that it's in the contradiction that you find the most productive place to work, space to work. So our biggest challenge is actually our biggest opportunity to do what I'll call here for us today, analysis as action. So how you can build a tool to both understand and confront injustice and inequality. So I'm going to, for my 30 seconds that I have left, maybe, I'm going to offer 3 key words, and you can aim for these 3 C's, and it's the only time you should aim for a C, okay? So the 3 C's are community, commonality, and complexity. So build a community and a network. However it works for you. Use your community to understand your issue. Don't look inward for your understanding. Look outward. Draw from the outside. Understand commonalities the umbrella issues faced by people, but also, like other people have said, intersectionality, okay? Develop frameworks that understand the things that tie us together, like globalization, but also overlapping identities, which are things that other people have mentioned. For example, immigrant women of color who are facing Islamophobia face it differently, right? Differentially. And the last one, which is complexity. Bring back complexity. The public discourse doesn't want you to think in a complex way. Bring that back, okay? We're encouraged to see things simply as black and white, understand both sides of a story as if there are two sides or only two sides, reject that in favor of complexity. Thanks.
Thank you. Hello, Noura Erakat from the School of Integrative Studies. What's up, students? I want to start by, I'm going to go off on what you said about complexity to encourage us to think about, and also what many of the speakers have said, to think about the role that power plays in thinking through discrimination and racism and prejudice. And I think we're constantly trying to walk this tightrope of both, being inclusive, tolerant, beautiful, salad, multicultural, at the same time that we have an allergy to actually naming what the problem is and naming power and the way that it's affecting us. And so I think that doing that obfuscates the way that we can both be victims and perpetrators at the same time. It's the reason that, for example, we can live in a racist society that practices a particular type of racial hierarchy, and yet nobody can say that we are a racist or that they know a racist because we like the people that we're around. So I want to start by distinguishing prejudice, which all of us exercise. We all have some prejudice, regardless of what it is. You're the best person in the world, the purest heart, but you have some prejudices, right? But you don't always act on them. When you act on them, that's discrimination. And then you begin to externally exhibit that discrimination. Now, racism is different than both those things because racism, you don't have to act on it. You don't have to even verbalize it, but it functions at the level of power and the maldistribution of power. So that groups can be discriminatory against one another, but not all groups can be equally racist of one another. And in fact, it's why certain groups, for example, don't have to say anything in society and can still be benefiting from certain racial privileges. And so let's name that, right? Even in our celebration of colorblindness, that should not make us unable to deal with these very tricky issues, which we see in our classroom, right? It's so uncomfortable. Everybody's uncomfortable when we start talking about it, and yet is going to be the first one to say, yeah, plurality, right? So what is it? What is that bridge that we can't cross? And I think so much of it actually is at the turn of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when we ended de jure discrimination as a matter of law, but were unable socially, collectively, to discuss what is it that made this system, de jure segregation, so pervasive for so long. It's the fact that we were able to end de jure segregation, but couldn't simultaneously say, we owe Black Americans reparations. Until we're able to say that, it means that we're collectively dealing with the power discrepancies between us. And so, I guess there's more that I wanted to say. The last thing that I'll say is this, and we can pick up on Zionism and anti-Semitism, which is so rich and one of the complicating issues, specifically in being able to bridge Muslim-Jewish alliances who share very much similar oppressions and very much have joint futures, emancipatory futures. And so I think that this is a significant issue. But let me end by saying this. When we think about power, one way to analyze it is to ask yourself, whose pain matters, right? All of us have pain. Whose pain matters? Whose fear matters? All of us are fearful, but some of us respond to that fear and are called violent, and others of us respond to that fear and are called that we're acting in self-defense. So when we start to scrutinize that kind of discourse and redevelop a grammar of being able to discuss those things that are really uncomfortable, I think we're just building the bridge forward to where we need to go. Thank you.
My name is Hatem El-Hibri. I'm an assistant professor of film and media studies, and I have the distinct benefit of going last because many smart people have sort of laid a framework for me. I don't know about you, but when I look at our contemporary historical moment, it seems like there's a rising tide of really awful things that are truly dispiriting, sometimes feel overwhelming, problems that have no solutions. And on top of that, we're told that many of these problems are like age old. Well, there's always been hatred, nothing you can do about that. And that is such a thoroughly unsatisfying, depoliticizing answer for me. Mm-hmm. There's very old roots for some of the ideologies underpinning these things. Shout out to Professor who went first. But fighting against the interlinked histories of anti-Semitism and anti-Islamic sentiment seem to me like all the more clear in this contemporary moment. And I'm going to speak about the US because we are in the US, we're in Northern Virginia. That these are both part of a system that alternately figures certain groups of people in racialized terms as either an internal threat or some kind of external threat which is weakening us, some presumed us on the inside, and us which is self-same, undifferentiated, and not marked by difference. It's all too easy to play spot the bigot. It's so reassuring, aha, somebody said something which is bigoted, and by naming that there, I have now demonstrated that I'm on the right side of things. Mm-hmm. As though the problem were simply that some people are mean to other people. The psychic wounding that takes place on an everyday life is a very real and present part of the problem, but I don't think that it's the only thing. I don't think it's solved by addressing things simply at that level. We could interrogate the historical conditions which produce this, but I'm going to say that I'm just going to focus for a second on the contemporary moment, since there are many much more qualified historians on this panel. Think not too long ago, when I say not too long ago, I mean about 20 years ago, when having neo-Nazi tattoos barred you from being able to enlist into the armed services or to the police force. Around the perpetuation of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, the U.S. Armed Forces lifted that. You could enlist with like swastikas and stuff tattooed on your body. Those people now have military training. Some of those people end up serving on police forces. Not too long ago, we know this because a group called Unicorn Riot published this, that a police officer by the name of Daniel Morley was actually a member of Identity Europa and was subsequently fired by Chesterfield County Police. He served specifically in a minority-majority school. This should not hearten you, that an outside group had to police the police to tell them to get rid of somebody like this. Liberal politics, historically, do not protect us from fascist creep. Why did this person end up serving on the police to begin with? You could ask, where is potentially the worst possible future of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia? Look at what we do with migrant children right now. We cage them and their screams are justifiable. I said earlier that it's all too easy to play spot the bigot. And instead of simply saying what we shouldn't do, I'm going to end by saying something I think we should do. We need to look very carefully, very intently at the soil in which this nonsense grows. There's nothing inevitable about this kind of racism. You have to teach people, you have to build systems and build incredible amounts of violence to make this stuff hold up, to make this stuff cohere and seem like it has coherence. Certainly, we need to talk about collective models of emancipation, solidarities, which can push back against this effectively. But we need to also, I think, look very carefully at what kind of ties can be formed which would make things like anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim sentiment unimaginable and not ground on which they could grow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please help me thank our panelists and President Cabrera.